The wind came first, carrying the scent of rain, and something else James couldn't name. He'd learned in his 6 years on the Montana plains that the land spoke its own language, warnings written in the behavior of birds and the way grass bent before storms. But this morning the message felt different, dangerous. His gelding, a sturdy bay named Angus, shifted uneasily beneath him as they crested the rise overlooking Bitterroot Valley. James had ridden out at dawn from his homestead to check fence lines along the northern boundary, the kind of routine work that filled the days of men who traded civilization for solitude. At 38, he'd grown comfortable with silence, had learned to read meaning in the empty spaces between one moment and the next. What he saw in the valley below made his breath catch. A figure knelt beside a collapsed pack frame, working with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure here in the middle of nowhere could mean death. Even from 200 yards up, James could see the problem. The wooden frame that should have held supplies on the travois behind a horse had shattered, spilling what looked like dried meat and hide bundles across the ground. The figure was a woman. That much was clear from her silhouette and the way she moved. Her clothing marked her as Lakota, the buckskin dress decorated with quill work catching the morning light. Her horse, a paint mare, stood patiently nearby, and James could see the animal's ribs showing through its coat. They'd been traveling hard and hungry. Every instinct James had developed since coming to Montana in 1883 screamed at him to turn around. The Lakota and white settlers had been at war on and off for decades. The massacre at Wounded Knee was still 2 years in the future, but tensions ran high across the territory. Stopping to help could mark him as a sympathizer, could bring trouble from both sides, could get him killed by people who saw kindness as weakness. But James had been raised Presbyterian in the Highlands of Scotland, had grown up with his mother's voice reading scripture by firelight. The parable of the Good Samaritan had been beaten into him as thoroughly as his father's lessons about sheep farming. And 6 years in Montana, 6 years of watching neighbors struggle and sometimes fail to survive, had taught him that isolation was its own kind of death. He'd tried isolation after Catherine died. For 3 years after the fever took her in 1886, he'd withdrawn from the community, in Great Falls had stopped attending church services, and town meetings had convinced himself that if he kept everyone at arm's length, he'd never hurt that way again. But loneliness had nearly destroyed him more completely than grief ever could. James guided Angus down the slope, the horse picking its way carefully through scattered rock and sage. The woman heard him coming and stood at her hand, moving to something at her belt. A knife, James realized. She was prepared to defend herself, and he couldn't blame her. He stopped 30 feet away, close enough to be heard, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. He raised both hands slowly, showing he carried no weapon drawn. His rifle remained in its scabbard on the saddle. "I mean no harm," he called out. His voice carried the burr of his Scottish accent, softened by 6 years in America but never fully erased. "I saw you were in difficulty. Can I offer assistance?" The woman studied him with dark eyes that revealed nothing. She was perhaps 25, her face marked by the kind of weathering that came from living exposed to wind and sun. Her hands, he noticed, were cut and bleeding from working with the splintered wood. She didn't answer immediately, and James waited. He'd learned that rushing people in this country was a good way to create misunderstanding. He sat quiet on Angus, keeping his hands visible, letting her take his measure. Finally, she gestured to the broken frame. "The ash wood split. I cannot repair it alone." Her English was accented but clear, each word chosen carefully. James felt relief wash through him. At least they could communicate. He dismounted slowly, moving like he would around spooked livestock, and walked to examine the damage. The main crosspiece had indeed split clean through, probably from stress and age combined. The wood was old, dried out, brittle. It needed replacing entirely, not just binding. "I have ironwood in my pack," James said. "Stronger than ash. If you'll permit it, I can fashion a replacement." She considered this, her hand still near her knife. Then she nodded once, a sharp gesture that carried the weight of decision. James pulled his tools from his saddlebag. A small saw and auger for drilling whole strips of wet rawhide for binding. He'd learned to carry repair supplies after his own wagon had broken down 20 miles from anywhere in his first winter here. That mistake had nearly killed him, and he didn't make the same mistake twice. He worked methodically, cutting the ironwood to length drilling holes for the rawhide bindings, testing the fit. The woman watched every movement with that same intense focus, as if memorizing his techniques. It made him self-conscious in a way he hadn't felt in years, aware of being observed and judged. "You know this craft well," she said after several minutes. "My father was a carpenter before he was a shepherd," James replied, keeping his eyes on his work. "He taught me that good tools and knowledge of how to use them can save your life in wild country." "Your father was wise." "Aye, he was." James felt the familiar ache of old grief. "He died when I was 16, fell from a roof he was repairing. I learned after that how quickly things can change, how a single moment can alter everything." He wasn't sure why he was sharing this with a stranger, with someone he might never see again. Perhaps because she was a stranger, because there was safety in confessing to someone who existed outside his normal world. The repair took 45 minutes. James worked carefully, knowing that shoddy work here could have serious consequences. When he finished, he tested the frame by putting his full weight on it, checking for flexi or weakness. It held solid. "That should carry you wherever you're going," he said, stepping back. The woman examined his work with the thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on equipment not failing. She rolled the travois back and forth, checking each binding, each joint. Then she looked at him directly for the first time, and James saw something in her expression shift. "I am called Wihakaida," she said. "It means dream woman in your language. I am daughter of Tatanka Yotake, whom white men call Sitting Bull." The words hit James like cold water. Sitting Bull, the most famous Lakota chief in the territories, the man who had led the victory at Little Bighorn, who'd humiliated Custer and become a legend. And James had just helped his daughter alone and vulnerable in the middle of Montana. He should have been terrified. Should have understood immediately that this was more complicated than a simple act of kindness. But looking at Wihakaida's face, at the cuts on her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes, he saw only a person who'd needed help and received it. "James Mackenzie," he said. "From Scotland originally. I have a homestead 15 miles south." "I know," Wihakaida said quietly. "My people have watched you for 3 winters. You are the white man who keeps no slaves, who trades fairly with the Blackfeet, who buried the Métis woman with honor when others would have left her for wolves." James felt his chest tighten. He remembered that burial 18 months ago. A woman named Celeste had died giving birth alone in an abandoned cabin 3 miles from his property. He'd found her too late to save her or the baby, but he'd dug graves and said prayers over them. Both had carved their names into wood markers because he couldn't stand the thought of them lying forgotten. He'd thought he was alone that day. Apparently he hadn't been. "She deserved better than an unmarked grave," he said simply. Wihakaida loaded her supplies back onto the repaired travois, working with the efficient movements. When she finished, she turned to James one more time. "My father believes all white men are thieves and liars. I told him some might be different. He sent me out alone to test this, to see what would happen when I appeared vulnerable." She paused. "You have proven me right. That is good for my standing with my people. But it may be dangerous for you." Before James could ask what she meant, she mounted her paint horse and rode north without looking back. He stood in the empty valley, watching her disappear, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd been tested. She'd said it plainly, which meant this wasn't a random encounter, wasn't coincidence. It meant people had been watching him, evaluating him, waiting to see what he would do. James climbed back onto Angus and began the ride home, his mind churning. The fence line could wait. Something larger had just entered his life, something he didn't yet understand, but could feel gathering like those storm clouds on the horizon. His homestead appeared an hour later, nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. 160 acres of grassland and timber, a cabin of rough pine logs, a small barn for Angus, and the milk cow, a chicken coop. It wasn't much, but it was his, paid for with 6 years of hard labor and the last of the money he'd brought from Scotland. He unsaddled Angus, checked the animal's water-gathered eggs from the coop. Normal tasks that felt strange now, as if he were performing a play for an unseen audience. He kept scanning the ridgelines, looking for movement, for watchers. That night, James slept poorly. He dreamed of Catherine, her face pale with fever, her hand in his as she died. He dreamed of the Métis woman Celeste lying in that abandoned cabin. And he dreamed of Wihakaida's words, "It may be dangerous for you." Morning came too early. James rose stiff and unrested, made coffee over the fire, tried to force himself to eat biscuits that tasted like sawdust. He was standing at his door, looking out at the dawn, when he heard it. Horses. Many horses. The sound came from the east, growing louder. James's first instinct was to grab his rifle to barricade himself inside. But something made him step into the open instead, made him stand in front of his cabin with empty hands and face whatever was coming. They appeared over the ridge like a wave breaking. Lakota warriors on painted horses moving in a formation that spoke of discipline and purpose. James counted quickly, trying to control the fear that wanted to close his throat. 30, 40, more still coming. They surrounded his homestead in 3 rings, the horses moving in synchronized circles that made the ground tremble. The warriors wore paint red and black and white designs that transformed their faces into masks of ceremony. Some carried rifles. Others held traditional weapons, bows and lances decorated with feathers and scalps. In the center of the formation, between 2 massive warriors, rode Wihakaida. She sat on her paint horse with the bearing of royalty, no longer the vulnerable traveler from yesterday, but someone who commanded absolute authority. Behind her, on a gray stallion that must have stood 17 hands high, sat a man James recognized from wanted posters and newspaper descriptions. Tatanka Iyotake, Sitting Bull. His face was lined with age and warfare, his hair gray but his eyes sharp as broken glass. He wore a single eagle feather and carried himself with the weight of someone who'd led thousands in battle. They stopped. The horses held perfectly still, as if they were part of a painting. The only sound was wind through grass and James's own heartbeat hammering in his ears. One of the large warriors dismounted. He stood at least 6'4", with shoulders like an ox and the scars that mapped decades of combat. He drove a lance into the earth in front of James's cabin and spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying formal cadence. James understood perhaps 1 word in 10, but the tone was clear. This was declaration, judgment, the opening of something that would determine whether he lived or died. Wihakaida dismounted and walked forward, the warriors parting for her. She stood 10 feet from James and translated, her voice neutral. Mapia Luta, whose name means red cloud in English, has declared you summoned. You are to answer for touching the property of Tatanka Iotake's daughter without permission. You are to prove whether your actions were guided by honor or deception. James kept his hands visible, kept his voice steady despite the fear. I meant no offense. I saw someone in need and offered help, that's all. Wihakaida translated for Red Cloud, who responded sharply. She turned back to James. He says intention matters less than action. You could have been trying to gain favor, to infiltrate our trust, to learn our weaknesses. White men have done this before. Used kindness as a weapon. I gained nothing from helping you, James said, looking directly at Wihakaida. I didn't even know who you were. That is what will be tested, she replied. My father has decided you will face trials. 3 of them. If you pass, you will be declared proven a man of honor. If you fail, you will answer with your life. The words hung in the air like smoke. James understood this wasn't negotiable, wasn't something he could talk his way out of. He'd stumbled into something larger than himself, into a test he hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. What kind of trials? He asked. Wihakaida looked to her father. Sitting Bull spoke for the first time, his voice rough with age but carrying authority that made every warrior straighten. She translated, the first will test your body, the second will test your mind, the third will test your spirit. Most white men fail the third even when their bodies and minds are strong. But you will be given the chance to prove yourself. James thought about running, about grabbing Angus and riding south until the horse collapsed. But he'd been in Montana long enough to know that running from Lakota warriors in their own territory was suicide. They'd run him down within miles and he'd die exhausted and afraid instead of standing his ground. He thought about Catherine, about the vows they'd made in that small church in Glasgow. Till death do us part. She died, but he was still here, still living, still trying to figure out what honor meant in a world that seemed designed to punish it. I'll face your trials, he said, but I want to understand why. Why does my helping your daughter matter so much? Sitting Bull spoke again, longer this time. Wihakaida translated, and James heard something unexpected in her voice. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. My father says he is old. 60 years he has lived, and he has seen our people pushed back again and again until we have almost nothing left. The white government wants all Lakota on reservations within 3 years. Our way of life is ending. She paused, and James saw pain cross her face. But before it ends completely, my father wants to know if there are white men worth respecting. Men who do right things, even when no one watches. Men who might be allies instead of enemies in the future that is coming. You are being tested not just for yourself, but for what you represent. The possibility that not all white men are the same. The weight of that responsibility settled on James's shoulders like physical burden. He wasn't just answering for himself. He was answering for every white settler in Montana, every homesteader and merchant and soldier. The unfairness of it burned in his chest, but he understood that fairness wasn't part of this equation. "When do the trials begin?" he asked. Red Cloud pulled a knife from his belt and showed it to James. The blade was obsidian napped to razor sharpness. He spoke and Wihakaida translated. "Now the first trial tests endurance. You will be bound and left to stand while the sun crosses the sky. You will not sit. You will not fall. You will not cry out. If you fail, the blade will answer." Two warriors came forward with leather rope, moving with the efficiency of men who'd done this before. They bound James's wrist behind a post that Red Cloud drove into the earth, the rawhide wet and cold against his skin. They positioned his feet shoulder-width apart and marked the ground with white powder. "If your feet leave those marks," Wihakaida said quietly, "you fail." Then they stepped back, and James was alone in the center of the circle, surrounded by 60 warriors who'd come to watch him break. The sun was directly overhead. That meant hours, maybe 5 or 6, standing without relief in the Montana summer heat. James had worked long days before, had pushed his body hard during harvest seasons and winter storms. But this was different. This was designed to break him, to find his limits and push past them. He focused on breathing, in through the nose or out through the mouth. Steady, controlled. He thought about his father teaching him to endure long days of shepherding in the Scottish Highlands, standing in cold rain for hours watching the flock. "Pain is temporary," his father had said. "Character is permanent." The first hour passed. James's legs began to ache, a dull throb that spread from his calves to his thighs. The rope around his wrists had already started to tighten as it dried, cutting into his skin. He could feel blood trickling down his forearms. The second hour brought cramps. His muscles seized and released in waves that made his vision blur. Sweat soaked his shirt and ran into his eyes. The warriors watched in silence, their faces expressionless behind their war paint. In the third hour, James began to see things that weren't there. Catherine standing in the circle, reaching for him. His father walking toward him with tools in his hands. Celeste holding her dead baby, asking why he hadn't come sooner. He blinked, and they disappeared. Just heat and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The fourth hour was when his body began to rebel. His knees trembled, threatening to buckle. The pain in his shoulders had gone beyond burning into something that felt like his joints were being pulled apart. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt swollen. He wanted to fall, wanted to let his legs give out to end this torture, even if it meant death. But something stubborn in him refused. Maybe it was Scottish pride. Maybe it was the memory of Catherine telling him he was the strongest man she'd ever known. Maybe it was just meanness, the determination not to give these warriors the satisfaction of watching him quit. As the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the circle, an old warrior stood from where he'd been sitting. He walked to the edge of the marked circle and began to chant low and rhythmic, wordless, but somehow full of meaning. 3 other warriors joined him, their voices creating harmony. James didn't understand the language, didn't know if it was support or mockery or something else entirely. But the sound wrapped around him like a rope, giving him something to focus on besides the pain. The shadow of the western ridge finally touched the white powder marks around James's feet. Red Cloud stood and walked toward him with deliberate steps. He drew the obsidian knife and raised it high, and James's exhausted mind couldn't process whether this was execution or completion. The blade came down and cut through the rawhide ropes in one smooth motion. James's arms fell forward, and the relief was so intense it made his vision white out for a moment. His knees unlocked, and his whole body swayed, but something primal in him refused to fall. He locked his legs one more time, locked them with the last strength he possessed, and remained standing. The warriors erupted, not with hostility, but with something that sounded almost like approval. They struck their lances against the ground in rhythm, creating a drumbeat that made the earth tremble. Wihakaida's face showed emotion for the first time since this had begun. Something like relief flooded her features. She came close enough to speak quietly. You have passed the first trial, but understand what comes next is harder. The body is simple. The mind is complex. And most men with strong bodies have weak minds. James was allowed to collapse, though even that was controlled, sitting rather than sprawling. An older woman brought water, allowing him 3 small sips. When he looked at her questioningly, she spoke sharply in Lakota. We Hakita translated. She says, drink too much and you vomit. Then you shame yourself before the second trial. The woman examined James's wrists, which were cut deep enough to need attention. She applied a paste that smelled of plants James didn't recognize, then wrapped them in clean cloth. Red Cloud spoke again, and Wihakaita moved closer to translate. He says you have proven your body strong, which surprises him for a man of 38 winters. But the second trial measures something different. It measures whether you understand what matters, whether you can see beyond yourself. 20 minutes later, not nearly enough time to recover, another warrior stepped forward. He carried a clay vessel sealed with wax. He broke the seal, and the smell of water, fresh and cold, drifted across the circle. James's cracked lips burned at the scent. Every cell in his body screamed for moisture. But the warrior tilted the vessel and poured the water onto the ground, where it vanished instantly into the thirsty earth. Then he held the empty vessel toward James, offering it, and James, exhausted and dehydrated and desperate, had to decide what this meant. What the right answer was, whether he was being offered nothing or everything. James stared at the empty clay vessel in the warrior's hands. His throat burned, his tongue felt thick and useless, and every instinct screamed at him to reach out to take what was being offered, even though it held nothing. But something made him pause. Some lesson learned from watching these people, from understanding that nothing they did was without meaning layered beneath the obvious. He forced his exhausted mind to think past desperation. The warrior had poured the water out deliberately, ceremonially, making sure everyone saw it vanish into the earth. Now he offered the empty vessel. Why, James's eyes scanned the circle of faces watching him. Warriors who'd sat for 6 hours in brutal heat without drinking. He'd been so focused on his own suffering, he hadn't noticed theirs. But now he saw the cracked lips, the sun-weathered skin, the discipline required to watch and wait without seeking relief. They'd imposed the same deprivation on themselves that they'd imposed on him. That kind of shared sacrifice spoke to something deeper than individual need. It spoke to a culture where the collective mattered more than the self. James thought about his early days in Montana, about the drought of 1884, when wells ran dry and neighbors had to share what little water they had. He remembered one settler, a man named Crawford, who'd hoarded his well water while everyone else shared. The community had shunned him, stopped trading with him, forced him to leave. Catherine had explained it to him one night. In harsh country, she'd said, survival depends on sharing. The man who takes only for himself ensures everyone dies alone. James's hand trembled as he reached out, but instead of taking the vessel, he pushed it gently back toward the warrior. His voice came out as a rasp. Give it to them. They've waited as long as I have. Their thirst is real too. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The warrior holding the vessel looked shocked, as if this response was unexpected, perhaps unprecedented. Then a murmur rippled through the assembled warriors like wind moving through grass. Some nodded slowly. The old warrior who'd chanted during the first trial struck his chest with his closed fist in a gesture that needed no translation. Red Cloud stood and walked toward James, studying him with new intensity. When he spoke, his tone had changed from judge to something closer to teacher. Wihakaita translated, and James heard the shift in her voice. You have proven you understand the second law. A man who thinks only of himself dies alone. A man who thinks of others first will never thirst, because others will remember and care for him in turn. The warrior raised the vessel high so everyone could see. Then he took a long drink himself and passed it to the warrior beside him, who drank and passed it on. James watched it make the entire circuit, each person taking only 2 or 3 swallows, disciplined even in their thirst, sharing equally. A different warrior refilled the vessel from a larger water bag and brought it to James. This time when it was offered, James understood he was allowed to drink. He took 3 careful swallows, fighting the urge to gulp it all, knowing that restraint mattered as much as the earlier choice. The water was cool and clean, the best thing he had ever tasted. Those 3 swallows felt like salvation. Sitting Bull spoke for the second time, addressing James directly. Wihakaida translated, and James heard warning beneath the words. My father says you have passed 2 trials. Body and mind both proved worthy. But the third trial's the one that matters most. It reveals what a man truly values beneath all his words and actions. Many men have strong bodies. Some have wise minds. Few have pure hearts. This is where most fail. The third warrior stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it slowly with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred objects. Inside was a rifle, but not just any rifle. James recognized it immediately as a Henry repeating rifle .44 caliber brass frame gleaming in the afternoon sun, worth at least $100, maybe more. A weapon like that could mean the difference between eating and starving, between defending yourself and dying. But what made James's chest tighten wasn't the rifle itself. It was the carving on the stock. Intricate designs worked into the wood symbols and patterns that represented months of painstaking labor. Someone had loved this weapon, had transformed it from tool into art. Sitting Bull took the rifle from the warrior and held it with visible emotion. When he spoke, his voice was softer, and James heard old grief in it. Wihakaida translated her own voice, thick with feeling. This rifle belonged to my brother Ohayesa, which means winner. He took it from a dead soldier at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer fell. He carved these designs himself over 2 winters, each symbol telling a story of our people. He carried it for 9 years, and it never failed him. She paused, struggling to maintain composure. 5 years ago, cavalry raided our winter camp, bluecoats from Fort Keogh coming before dawn. Ohayesa was protecting me and our mother. A soldier shot him, and he died covering us with his body. This rifle is all I have of my brother. It is his hands, his courage, his love made physical. I would die before losing it. The weight of that story settled over the clearing like a shroud. James understood now why this was the final test. This wasn't about right answers or physical endurance. This was about exposing who someone was at their core when everything else was stripped away. Sitting Bull placed the rifle on the ground in front of James. He spoke, and Wihakaida translated her voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday, this rifle was in my daughter's travois, wrapped and hidden. You repaired the travois. You could have seen it, could have taken it. You didn't. But maybe only because you didn't know its value, didn't know who we were. The chief's next words felt like steel closing around James's chest. So I ask you this, James Mackenzie. If you had known who Wihakaida was yesterday, if you had known this rifle was there, would you have helped her, or would you have taken the rifle and left her stranded? James's mind reeled. There was no safe answer to this question. If he said he would have helped anyway, they'd call him a liar because all men were selfish. If he said he would have taken the rifle, he admitted to being a thief. If he said he didn't know, he was a coward. He thought about his past, about the man he'd been at different times. At 25, newly arrived in America with Catherine and Hope, he'd been generous. He'd found a lost child once in Glasgow and spent 3 hours searching for the parents instead of just leaving the boy for the constables to find. But that was before loss, before hardship, before Montana had taught him that kindness could get you killed. After Catherine died, after the fever took her in 1886, James had changed. He'd become harder, more careful. 3 years ago, he'd ridden past a Métis family being harassed by drunk miners. He'd heard the shouting, seen the trouble, and kept riding because it wasn't his problem. He'd learned later that the miners had beaten the father badly, and James had lived with that guilt ever since. 2 years ago, he'd found an abandoned miners' camp. The owner was clearly dead or fled. James had taken tools from it, good tools worth maybe $50. He'd used them to maintain his homestead and hated himself a little each time he picked up a hammer that had belonged to someone else. So which James would have stopped yesterday if he'd known the young idealist, the bitter widower, the guilty coward. He honestly didn't know, and that uncertainty was more damning than any lie. James looked at Sitting Bull, at Wihakaida, at Red Cloud. Then he said the only thing he could say. I cannot answer that question. The reaction was explosive. Warriors erupted in shouts, some jumping to their feet. A young warrior named Wakinyan, whom James had noticed earlier for his aggressive stance, stepped forward with his hand on his tomahawk. He refuses to answer. He admits guilt through silence. Other voices joined in, angry and confused. The careful structure of the ceremony seemed to collapse into chaos. Sitting Bull's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. Wihakaida looked stricken, her relief from the first trial replaced by the recognition that she gambled everything on James and he'd just failed her. But James kept talking, raising his voice above the chaos. I cannot answer because I will never be that man again. The warriors quieted, confused now rather than angry. James pressed on, knowing these might be his last words. I cannot answer because I will never again be the man who didn't know who you were yesterday. That James Mackenzie made a choice based on ignorance, on not understanding the stakes. But we're never the same person we were yesterday. Every choice we make, everything we learn, it changes us. He took a breath, his bound hands reaching for the rifle on the ground between them. So I can't tell you what yesterday's James would have done if he'd known about the rifle. Maybe he would have taken it. Maybe not. I honestly don't know. And claiming I do would be a lie. James picked up the rifle, the brass frame cold and smooth in his hands. But I can tell you what today's James would do, knowing everything I know now, knowing who you are and what this means and what's at stake. He held the rifle out toward Wehakeda, his eyes meeting hers. I would help you again. I would help you even if it cost my life, because some things matter more than survival, because I'm tired of being the man who rides past people in trouble, because maybe this is my chance to stop living with guilt and start living with honor. The rifle trembled in his outstretched hands. Take it. It's yours. It was always yours. And if you judge me worthy, maybe I can finally be the man my wife believed I was. Maybe I can be someone I'm not ashamed to remember. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold still. James knelt there with the rifle extended, his arms shaking from exhaustion and emotion, knowing he'd either just saved himself or sealed his death. Wihakaida stepped forward slowly. She took the rifle from his hands, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. Tears ran freely down her face now, and she made no attempt to hide them. She turned to her father and spoke in Lakota, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion. Whatever she said made several of the older warriors nod thoughtfully. Sitting Bull took the rifle from his daughter and examined it, as if seeing it for the first time, running his fingers over the carvings his dead son had made. When he looked up at James, his eyes held something new. Recognition, as if he'd finally seen past the white skin to something deeper underneath. The chief spoke at length, his words carrying across the valley. When he finished, several warriors struck their chests with that gesture of respect. Wihakaida translated, and James heard wonder in her voice. My father says you have answered the question no man has answered correctly. Others claimed they would help, and we knew they lied. Others admitted they would steal, and we killed them for honesty without honor. But you said something new, something we have never heard. She paused, making sure every word carried its weight. You said you don't know who you were, but you know who you are. You said we are not prisoners of our past selves. That every sunrise we can choose to be different than we were yesterday. Sitting Bull handed the rifle back to Wihakaida with a gesture that seemed to carry more meaning than James could fully grasp. The chief turned to face the assembled warriors and raised both hands above his head. He spoke in a voice that rang off the valley walls like thunder. The warriors responded as one, how, how, how. 3 times they shouted, then they dismounted and struck their lance butts into the ground in rhythmic pounding that made the earth tremble. Wehakaida moved closer to James, close enough that he could hear her whisper beneath the drumming. You have passed all 3 trials. My father declares you proven a man of true heart, who acted without knowing the stakes and would act the same, knowing everything. But even as relief washed through him, James saw that one warrior remained mounted. Wakinyan, the aggressive young man, sat on his horse with his jaw set and eyes burning with something that looked like righteous anger. He didn't cheer, he didn't strike his lance. He simply waited until the celebration died down, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, and he spoke in English, so there could be no misunderstanding. He has passed 3 trials of single moments, but I have a 4th question. The warriors who'd been celebrating fell silent. Sitting Bull turned slowly to look at Wakinyan, his expression unreadable. Wihakaida stiffened, and James heard her draw a sharp breath. This wasn't part of the ceremony. This was something else, something dangerous. Wakinyan dismounted with deliberate slowness and walked toward the center. He was perhaps 25, powerfully built, with combat scars marking him as someone who'd seen real fighting. Old man Wakanyan said his English, heavily accented but clear. You pass tests of body, mind, and spirit. But these tests are for moments. I ask about years. Years of choices. Years of actions. He turned to address Sitting Bull, directly switching to Lakota. Wihakaida translated in a whisper. He's saying, we honor this white man, but do we know his past? Maybe he helps one woman one time, but maybe he killed many Lakota before. Maybe there is blood on his hands we don't know about. A murmur ran through the warriors. This was doubt creeping back into a situation that had seemed resolved. Wakinyan turned back to James, his eyes hard as flint. James Mackenzie, you say you are 38 winters old. You came to Montana in 1883. That is 6 years. 6 years during time of war between our peoples. 6 years of raids and battles and blood. His voice grew louder, more challenging. Did you fight against Lakota? Did you join settler militias? Did you kill our warriors defending their land? Because if you did, then all your pretty words about honor mean nothing. You are our enemy, and we celebrate you with our brother's blood still fresh on your hands. James could have lied. There was no way to verify his past, but he'd built his defense in the third trial on honesty, on admitting complexity. To lie now would destroy everything. He met Wakinyan's eyes and chose truth even knowing it might kill. No, I never fought against Lakota, but I killed a Blackfoot warrior in the winter of 1885. The words fell like stones, warriors stiffened, hands moving toward weapons. James continued, forcing himself to keep speaking. There was a dispute over hunting grounds near Great Falls. The Blackfoot claimed we were poaching on their territory. They were right, we were, but we were starving. 3 of us settlers had almost nothing left. We ventured onto land we shouldn't have. He swallowed hard. A Blackfoot warrior confronted us. We argued. It escalated. He drew a knife, so did I. We fought. He slipped on ice and I drove my blade into his chest. The clearing erupted again. Wakinyan's face split in a triumphant smile. You hear, he admits it. He killed one of the people of this land. Now we honor him. But James wasn't finished. He raised his voice again. I killed him because I was scared and foolish and thought I had a right to land that wasn't mine. I was wrong. And I've lived with that weight every day since. He looked around at the assembled warriors. I don't ask forgiveness for that. I can't erase what I did, but I learned from it. I stopped hunting on disputed ground. I started trading fairly with the Blackfoot bands that would deal with me. I tried to be better than the man who killed over a rabbit and 3 grouse. Wakinyan drew his knife, Spanish steel glinting in the fading light. I demand combat trial. Him against me, knives only. If his heart is true, let him prove it with blood. If I win, he dies as he deserves. If he wins, perhaps he has earned forgiveness. Sitting Bull looked torn, caught between the ceremony he'd just completed and this new challenge he couldn't easily refuse. His eyes moved from Wakinyan to James and back. Finally, he looked at James and spoke. Wihakaida translated, her voice tight with worry. My father asks if you accept this challenge. James was exhausted. 6 hours tied to a post, dehydrated, his wrists cut, and bandaged, his body pushed beyond its limits. Wakinyan was a decade younger, fresh-skilled with a blade and burning with righteous anger. This wasn't a fair fight. It was an execution with extra steps. I accept, James said quietly. No. Wihakaida stepped forward, her composure breaking. This isn't fair. He's exhausted. He's already proven himself. Fair. James held up a hand. I killed one of his people. This is fair. He looked at Wakinyan. But before we fight, I want to tell you about that day. About what happened and what it made me become. If after hearing it you still want my blood, then we fight. Wakinyan sneered. Old man's trick, stalling. No trick, just truth, all of it. Sitting Bull considered, then nodded. Speak, we will listen. Then there will be combat. James sat heavily in the dirt, too exhausted to stand for this. The warriors formed a tighter circle. Wihakaida came to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Winter of 1885, James began. My wife Catherine had died that autumn from fever. I was alone grieving, barely surviving. I had flour for maybe 2 more weeks. No meat, no way to get supplies until spring thaw. He looked around at the faces watching him. I was hunting near the Marias River, well beyond where I had any right to be. I knew it was Blackfoot territory, but I was desperate. I thought if I could just kill something, anything, I'd make it through to spring. His voice grew rougher with memory. I shot a rabbit and 3 grouse. Not much, but enough for a week if I was careful. Then I heard a voice behind me, a Blackfoot warrior, maybe 30 years old. He said I was poaching, that I needed to leave and leave the game. "What did you do?" Wihakata asked softly. I argued, told him I was starving, that I meant no disrespect. He said his people were starving too, that white settlers had driven away the buffalo and the elk, that we'd already taken too much. James closed his eyes, seeing it again. He was right about all of it, but I was too proud and too scared to admit it. I said I'd killed the game and it was mine. He drew his knife. So did I. The memory played out in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. We circled each other. I'd never fought with a knife before. I was a carpenter's son, not a warrior, but Catherine had been dead for 3 months and I'd stopped caring whether I lived or died. That made me dangerous in a different way. He opened his eyes and looked at Wakinyan. He attacked first. I blocked. We grappled. His foot hit a patch of ice and he slipped. Just for a second, and in that second I drove my blade into his chest. Silence. I watched him die. It took maybe a minute. He said something I didn't understand, probably a prayer or a curse. And I realized, standing there looking at him, that I'd just killed a man over meat that would last me a week at most. James's voice cracked. I buried him. I didn't know the proper ceremonies, so I did what I knew. I dug a deep grave, I said a Presbyterian prayer over him, and I carved a mark in a tree so the spot could be found. Then I took the meat home and I couldn't eat any of it. It rotted in my cabin while I starved because every time I looked at it, I saw his face. He looked around at the assembled Lakota. After that, I changed how I lived. I only hunted on land I owned or had permission to use. I started trading with Blackfoot bands that would deal with me, trying to make amends in whatever small ways I could. And I promised myself I'd never again kill over something that didn't matter. Wakinyan was silent for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, what was he wearing? The question surprised James. What? The warrior you killed. What was he wearing? James closed his eyes, pulling up details he'd tried to forget. Buckskin shirt, beaded vest with blue and white patterns, eagle feather in his hair. A scar on his left cheek here. He touched his own face. Wakinyan's expression shifted. Something in his eyes changed, hardened and softened at the same time. That was my uncle, Otaktai, swift runner. He was teaching me to hunt, to track, to be a man. He never came home that day. We found his grave 3 weeks later. The words hit James like a fist. The clearing seemed to spin around him. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Wakinyan looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he sheathed his knife. You buried him with honor. You marked the grave so we could find him. You said prayers even though he was your enemy. His voice was rough. Most white men would have left him for wolves. He extended his hand to James, not in the white man's handshake, but palm to palm, the warrior's grip. I don't forgive you. Maybe I never will. But I don't kill you either, because you carry the same weight I carry. You live with ghosts like I live with ghosts. We are both haunted by that day. James took the offered hand, feeling the strength in Wakinyan's grip. Thank you, he said simply. Sitting Bull had been watching this exchange in silence. Now he stood and spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his 6 decades. Wihakata translated. My father says he has lived long enough to see much death. He has killed white soldiers, Mexican soldiers, enemy, tribe warriors, many good men who were not evil, just enemies. For hundreds of years we have fought over this land. We are losing. The chief looked at James with something that might have been respect. When my daughter met you, I tested her and you both. I wanted to know if all white men are the same. Today I learned no. Some white men carry pain like we carry pain. Some want peace like we want peace. Some change, some grow, some try to be better. Sitting Bull gestured to an old warrior who brought forward a leather cord with 3 stones threaded on it. White stone, red stone, black, lick stone. The chief took the cord and tied it around James's wrist with his own hands. You are proven, James Mackenzie. Not innocent, for you are not. Not forgiven, for some things cannot be forgiven. But honest, humble, and changed. Any Lakota who sees these stones will know you were judged and found worthy of respect. The warriors struck their chest again, and this time even Wakinyan joined in them. The sun was setting now, painting the valley in shades of red and gold. Sitting Bull spoke once more. Tonight we feast. Tomorrow you are free to return to your life. But if you wish, you could stay. Learn our ways, teach us yours, be a bridge between our peoples. You have earned that right. James looked at the 3 stones on his wrist, feeling their weight. I need time to think about that. But even as he said it, he knew what his answer would be. He'd spent 3 years in isolation after Catherine died, and it had nearly destroyed him. He'd been tested today and found something he'd thought was lost: the ability to matter, to be part of something larger than his own grief. That night around the fire, with food and stories being shared, James understood that his life had just divided into before and after. Before the proving, when he'd been a man adrift. After the proving, when he'd been given a second chance to live with purpose. He looked at the faces around the fire, at people who'd tested him brutally but fairly. At Wihakatum, who'd risked her standing to trust him. At Sitting Bull, who'd chosen to see him as something more than just another white settler. At Wakinyan, who'd found a way to honor his uncle's memory without adding more blood to the earth. I'll stay, James said quietly to Wihakata, for 3 months like you suggested. I'll learn what you have to teach, and maybe together we can build something that lasts beyond all this dying. She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Then tomorrow the real work begins. The morning after the proving, James woke to find his entire body one massive bruise. His wrists throbbed where the rawhide had cut deep. His legs could barely support his weight, the muscles shredded from 6 hours of standing. Even breathing hurt his ribs, protesting every expansion of his lungs. But he was alive. And more than alive, he was proven. The camp had been set up overnight in a natural bowl of land near his homestead. 20 lodges hid teepees decorated with painted designs that told family histories. Smoke rose from cook fires, mixing with the morning mist. The smell of cooking meat made his stomach growl, reminding him he'd eaten almost nothing in 2 days. Wihakaida found him attempting to stand, failing, trying again. You push yourself too hard, she said, crouching beside him. Your body needs rest. If I rest now, I'll never get moving again. James managed to lever himself upright, swaying slightly. My father used to say the worst thing you can do after hard labor is lie still. Makes everything stiffen up worse. She considered this. My grandmother said something similar. The body knows how to heal itself if you let it move slowly. Together they walked, James leaning more heavily on Wihakaida than he liked to admit. They made a slow circuit of the camp, and James felt eyes tracking them. Warriors who'd watched him pass the trials, women who were judging this white man their chief had declared worthy of respect. An old woman, her face carved with deep lines and her hair white as snow, approached them. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing at James's wrapped wrists. Wihakaida translated. She is Unsi, which means grandmother. She is a medicine woman, the most respected healer in our band. She wants to check your wounds, make sure they're not infected. James nodded, and Unsi unwrapped his wrists with surprising gentleness. The cuts were deep red and angry, but the paste applied yesterday had kept infection at bay. She made a disapproving sound and applied fresh medicine, a different mixture that smelled of pine and something sharper. She spoke again, and Wihakaida smiled. She says you're lucky you're too old to be stupid. Young men never sit still long enough to heal properly. Tell her I'm grateful, James said, and that in Scotland, we have a saying, there's no fool like an old fool, so I'm not sure age has made me any wiser. When Wihakaida translated, Unsi laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. She patted James's cheek with one weathered hand and said something that made Wihakaida blush. She says, perhaps I shouldn't translate that. Now you have to tell me, Wihakaida sighed. She says you'll make good husband material when the time comes because you can take pain without crying and you defer to women who know better than you. James felt heat rise in his face. I'm not looking for a wife. That's not what she said. She said when the time comes. Wihakaita's tone was carefully neutral. Unsi sees things others don't. She has the gift of knowing. Before James could respond, Sitting Bull emerged from a large lodge at the center of camp. He wore simpler clothing today, buckskin shirt and leggings, his gray hair loose. He looked older in the morning light, the lines in his face deeper, the weight of leadership visible in his posture. He gestured for James and Waihakaita to join him. Inside the lodge, the temperature was comfortable despite the growing heat outside. A small fire burned in the center, pit smoke rising through the opening at the top. Sitting Bull sat cross-legged and indicated James should do the same. The chief spoke and Waihakaita translated as she took her place beside her father. You said last night you would stay for 3 months. I want to understand what that means to you, what you hope to learn, what you are willing to give in exchange. James chose his words carefully. I want to understand your people, your language, your customs, your way of seeing the world. I've lived 6 years in Montana, and I know almost nothing about the people who were here first. That's shameful ignorance, and I want to correct it. Sitting Bull nodded slowly. And what will you give us? Whatever I can. I can teach carpentry building techniques that might help on the reservation. I can read and write English, can help with dealing with government agents who try to cheat you. I know farming, animal husbandry things that might be useful as your people are forced to adapt to a different way of life. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Forced to adapt. That was a gentle way of describing the cultural genocide that was happening across the territories. Sitting Bull was quiet for a long moment, studying James with those sharp eyes. The government will put all Lakota on reservations within 3 years, he said through Wihakaita. Probably sooner. Our way of life, the way we have lived for hundreds of years, is ending. I cannot stop this. No one can. But I can try to preserve what matters so our children don't forget who they are. He leaned forward. You will live in both worlds. You will keep your homestead, but also have a place in our camp. You will learn from us and teach us. You will be neither fully white nor fully Lakota, but something new. A bridge. That's what you said yesterday. But what does it actually mean day to day? Wihakaita answered, this time not waiting for her father. It means you'll spend half your time with us, half at your homestead. You'll learn our language from me, our customs from my father and the elders. You'll help negotiate with the Indian agent when he comes, help us understand the documents. They make us sign the promises they make and break. She paused. And in return, you'll teach our young people English, mathematics, how to navigate the white man's world that's swallowing ours. You'll help us survive what's coming without completely losing ourselves. It was a daunting task, maybe impossible, but James had spent 3 years doing nothing of consequence, and the weight of purposelessness had nearly crushed him. I'll do my best, he said, but I'm one man. I can't promise miracles. We don't want miracles, Sitting Bull said. We want someone who sees us as human beings, not savages or obstacles. Someone who will speak truth to both sides. That is rare enough to be valuable. They talked for another hour working out the practical details. James would spend 3 days with the Lakota learning and teaching, then 3 days at his homestead maintaining his land. He'd be present for negotiations with government agents, would help write letters and contracts, would serve as translator when needed. In exchange, he'd receive food, clothing, protection, and the knowledge that his life meant something beyond simple survival. When they finished, James emerged from the lodge to find the camp fully awake. Children played between the lodges, their laughter high and bright. Women worked on hides, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. Warriors cleaned weapons and tended horses, the daily work of people who'd been nomadic for generations and were now being forced to settle. Wakinyan approached, and James tensed slightly, unsure how yesterday's confrontation would carry forward. But the young warrior's face was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. I will teach you to fight properly, Wakinyan said without preamble. Yesterday you said you'd never trained with a blade. That's foolish. If you're going to live with us, you need to defend yourself. James blinked in surprise. You're offering to train me? My uncle would want me to. He was a teacher. Wakinyan's jaw tightened. And you honored him with burial. That creates obligation. Over the next 3 months, James's life fell into a rhythm stranger than anything he'd known in Scotland or even in his early Montana years. He learned Lakota language from Wihakeda, sitting with her every evening by firelight. The language was nothing like English or Scots Gaelic. It was full of sounds his throat didn't know how to make, concepts that didn't translate directly. But slowly, painfully, he began to understand. He learned customs from watching and asking questions. How to enter a lodge properly, when to speak and when to stay silent. The protocols around elders, around sacred objects, around death and birth and everything in between. Joaquinian taught him to fight, drilling him relentlessly with knife in hand-to-hand combat. James was too old and too slow to ever be a great warrior, but he learned enough to defend himself, enough to understand the discipline and skill behind movements that look simple but contain generations of refined technique. From Sitting Bull, he learned patience. The chief was a teacher in the old way, offering wisdom through stories rather than lectures. He told James about the history of his people, about battles fought and lost, about the slow erosion of everything they'd known. "The buffalo are almost gone," Sitting Bull said one night, his voice heavy with grief. "When I was a boy, herds covered the plains like grass. Now white hunters have killed them by the millions, leaving carcasses to rot while they take only hides. Without buffalo, we cannot live as we always have." And from all of them, James learned what it meant to live communally. The Lakota shared everything: food, tools, knowledge, hardship. No one went hungry while others ate. No one was abandoned when they weakened. It was a profound contrast to the individualistic settler culture James had known, where every man hoarded what he could and trusted no one. In return, James taught. He held lessons in English for the children and young adults, knowing that literacy would be crucial for survival in the world that was coming. He taught carpentry to men who wanted to learn, showing them how to build structures that would last on the reservation. And when the Indian agent arrived in September, James stood beside Sitting Bull and translated, making sure the chief understood every word of the contracts being offered. He caught 3 deliberate misrepresentations, places where the agent claimed the document said one thing when it said another. "This clause," James said, pointing to line 17 in the proposed treaty, "says you're agreeing to move to the reservation by December. Not that you're being given until December to prepare. The difference matters." The agent, a thin man named Carstairs with a waxed mustache and calculating eyes, frowned. "That's a rather fine distinction, Mr. Mackenzie." "No, it's a critical distinction. One allows time for preparation. The other makes them immediate squatters if they don't move instantly." Sitting Bull listened to James's translation and nodded slowly. Through Wihakeda, he responded, "Tell him we will consider his offer, but we do not sign today. We need time to discuss with our council." Carstairs' frown deepened. "The government expects prompt compliance." "Then the government should offer clear, honest terms," James said flatly, "not traps hidden in legal language." After Carstairs left, frustrated and empty-handed, Sitting Bull placed his hand on James's shoulder. "You see why we need you. White men trust words on paper more than spoken promises. You understand their tricks." But James found himself increasingly caught between 2 worlds that didn't fully trust him. Some Lakota, particularly younger warriors like Joaquinian's friends, viewed him as an outsider who would never truly understand. Some looked at the 3 stones on his wrist with resentment, feeling he had been given honor he hadn't fully earned. And when James returned to his homestead every few days to maintain his land, he found himself increasingly isolated from white society. Word had spread that he was living with hostiles, that he'd gone Indian. Former acquaintances in Great Falls stopped trading with him. The shopkeeper refused his business. Someone painted "Injun Lover" on his barn in crude letters. Wihakeda noticed his growing isolation during one evening lesson. They were working on verb conjugations, but James's mind was clearly elsewhere. "What troubles you?" she asked. "I'm losing both worlds," he admitted. "Your people don't fully trust me. Mine are starting to hate me. I'm becoming what your father said, something that belongs nowhere." Wihakeda was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret staying?" "No," James was surprised by how certain he felt. "Even with all this, I'd rather live with purpose and rejection than comfort and emptiness. But I won't lie and say it's easy." She reached out and touched the stones on his wrist. "These mark you as proven. That doesn't mean proven perfect. It means proven honest, proven willing to change. That's rarer than you think." As autumn deepened into winter, James found himself spending more time with the Lakota camp, less at his homestead. It was partly practical. Traveling back and forth in snow was difficult, but it was also emotional. The Lakota camp felt more like home than his cabin ever had, even with its isolation from his own people. He helped prepare for winter, teaching preservation techniques he'd learned in Scotland while learning the Lakota methods in return. He participated in ceremonies he didn't fully understand but respected deeply. And slowly, grudgingly, even the suspicious warriors began to accept his presence. Wakinyan became something like a friend, though neither would have used that word. They sparred regularly, James improving from completely incompetent to merely bad. One evening after practice, as they sat catching their breath, Wakinyan spoke without prompting. "I hated you when you first came. Wanted to kill you just for being white." James waited, knowing there was more. "But my uncle, Otakte, he would have approved of you. He always said strength isn't just physical. It's being able to admit when you're wrong, being able to change." Wakinyan looked at James directly. "You did that. You could have stayed hidden in your cabin, avoided all this. But you didn't." "I tried hiding for 3 years," James said. "It nearly destroyed me." "Yes, I can see that in your eyes, the ghost weight." Wakinyan touched his own chest. "We all carry it. The question is whether we let it crush us or make us stronger." Winter deepened. The Lakota camp moved to lower ground, sheltered from the worst winds. James helped them set up winter lodges using his carpentry skills to reinforce structures against the brutal Montana cold. It was during this time that he met Zitkala, whose name meant Red Bird. She was Wahakata's cousin, a woman of 30 with a quick laugh and sharper wit. She'd been widowed 2 years earlier when her husband died fighting the cavalry, and she'd raised her daughter alone since then. James didn't notice her attention at first. He was too focused on survival, on learning, on bridging two worlds that seemed determined to stay separate. But Unsi, the medicine woman, noticed. She started positioning Zitkala near James during meals, during lessons, during ceremonies. One evening, as snow fell outside and the lodge was warm with fire, and family Unsi spoke directly to James with Wihakaida translating and trying not to smile. "She says you've been alone long enough, that Catherine would want you to live again, not just exist, and that Zitkala has been alone long enough too. Perhaps you should consider whether two broken things might make one whole thing." James felt his face heat. "I'm not looking for a wife." "She didn't say you were looking. She said you should be." Wihakaida was definitely smiling now. Unsi has the gift of seeing. When she says something should happen, it usually does. James glanced across the lodge at Zitkala, who was helping her daughter with some handwork. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up and their eyes met. She didn't look away, didn't blush or giggle like he'd seen white women do. She simply held his gaze with a calm confidence that said she knew exactly what was being discussed and wasn't embarrassed by it. Over the next weeks, James found himself in Zitkala's company more often. Not by accident, he realized, but by Unsi's careful maneuvering. They worked together on winter preparations, sat near each other during evening stories, took walks through the snow under the pretense of checking game trails. Zitkala's English was limited, James's Lakota still imperfect, but they found ways to communicate. She taught him more about plants and healing. He taught her daughter, Wapandan, how to read English, and slowly, carefully, they began to build something neither had expected. One evening in late January, as wind howled outside and the lodge provided shelter and warmth, Zitkala spoke to James directly in halting English. "You still love your first wife. I see it. That is good. She should be remembered." James nodded, throat tight. "I still love my first husband. He was brave, kind, good father." She paused. "But the dead do not need us to stop living. They need us to honor them by living well." She reached out and took James's hand, the gesture simple but profound. "Maybe we both deserve to be less alone. Maybe we can honor the ones we lost by building something new." James looked at their joined hands, hers darker and calloused from work, his scarred and weathered. Two people who'd lost everything and somehow found their way to this moment. "I'd like that," he said quietly, "but I'm still a white man. I'll never fully be Lakota. Your people might not accept it." Zitkala smiled. "My people accepted you 3 months ago when you passed the trials. The stones on your wrist mean you are proven. That's enough." They were married in March in a Lakota ceremony James barely understood but deeply felt. Sitting Bull officiated and Wihakaida stood as witness. The community celebrated with feasting and stories, and James felt something he hadn't felt since Catherine died, belonging. His life became a strange hybrid. He maintained his homestead but lived primarily in the Lakota camp. He was neither fully white nor fully Lakota, but something in between, a bridge made flesh. When the government order came in June of 1890, mandating all Lakota move to reservations by September, James stood beside Sitting Bull as the chief made the impossible decision to comply. He watched a proud warrior bow to inevitability, choosing survival over death, preservation over destruction. "We cannot win this war," Sitting Bull told his people through tears, "but we can survive it. We can keep our language, our stories, our identity, even as we lose our land. That is the fight now, not for territory, but for soul." James helped negotiate the terms, got them better land on the reservation, got promises of rations and supplies, though he knew from experience those promises would be broken more often than kept, got them access to schools that would respect their culture while teaching new skills. It wasn't victory. It was managed defeat, but it was something. The move to the reservation happened in autumn. James walked with them, his wife and stepdaughter beside him, his homestead left behind. He'd sold it to a buyer in Great Falls for half what it was worth, and even then the man had looked at him with disgust for living with savages. Life on the reservation was hard. The land was poor, the rations insufficient, the Indian agent corrupt. But the people endured because endurance was what they'd always done. James continued his work as bridge. He taught English and mathematics. He wrote letters to government officials challenging injustices. He stood beside Sitting Bull in councils and negotiations. And he watched the old chief age rapidly under the weight of seeing his world die. Sitting Bull died in December 1890, killed by Indian police during a botched arrest. James was there holding the chief's hand as blood soaked into the frozen ground. The great leader's last words were to James in English. "Tell them we tried. Tell them we wanted peace. Tell them we were human." "I will," James promised. "For the rest of my life, I'll tell them." Weehakita took over much of her father's role, though she could never be chief formally. But people listened to her, respected her judgment. And James stood beside her, helping navigate the impossible task of preserving culture while adapting to survive. Years passed. James and Zitkala had 2 children of their own, a boy and a girl who grew up bilingual and bicultural. His homestead became a memory replaced by a life more complicated and more meaningful than anything he'd imagined. In 1920, 30 years after the proving, James sat on the porch of his house on the reservation. He was 68 years old now, weathered and tired, but not broken. The 3 stones still circled his wrist, worn smooth by decades of constant wear. His grandson, Tommy Wapan's son, sat beside him. The boy was 10, bright and curious, with 1 foot in each world his grandfather had bridged. "Tell me again, grandfather," Tommy said, "about the day you were proven." And James did. He told the whole story, from helping Weehakita repair the travois to the 3 trials to the fight with Wakinyan that had ended in understanding instead of blood. He told about learning a new language, a new culture, a new way of being human. He told about Sitting Bull's death, about Zitkala's love, about building a life between worlds. The proving wasn't about those 3 trials, James said as the story ended. It was about what came after, about choosing every day to be the person those trials revealed, about building bridges instead of walls. Tommy touched the stones on his grandfather's wrist. "Will these be mine someday? When I die, yes, but understand what they mean. They don't make you proven. They remind you that you can be. That change is possible at any age. That who you were yesterday doesn't have to be who you are tomorrow." The sun set over the reservation, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. James looked out at the land, at the community that had tested him and accepted him, and he felt something he'd spent years searching for. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because his life had mattered. Because he'd stood between 2 worlds and refused to let either one completely destroy the other. "Will you tell my children these stories?" Tommy asked. "If I live long enough," James said. "But whether I do or not, you'll tell them. The stones will pass to you, and with them, the responsibility of remembering, of being a bridge, of proving every day that different people can find common ground." That was his legacy, not the stones themselves, but what they represented, the possibility of change, the power of choosing honor over comfort. The hope that even in the darkest times, even when cultures were dying and worlds were ending, there could be people who stood in the middle and refused to let hate have the final word. James Mackenzie died 3 months later, peacefully, with his family around him and the 3 stones on his wrist. Tommy inherited them as promised, and with them, the stories, the responsibility, the bridge. And in a small house on a reservation in Montana, a 10-year-old boy became the keeper of a legacy that stretched back to a moment in 1889 when a 38-year-old man chose to stop and help a stranger, and in doing so changed the course of his life and the lives of everyone who came after. The stones passed on, the stories lived, the bridge endured, and that in the end was what it meant to be proven.